At this point of time in my life, I think I can comfortably say that horror games are pretty much one of my favorite genres of video games. I love the specific mood that a lot of games in the genre gear towards. Whether they be the claustrophobic, tension-filled hallway styles of Resident Evil, or the barren, empty, open-ended streets of Silent Hill, and just about everything else in between. There is something unquantifiable about the emotions that seem to purge out of me while playing horror games. I think a lot of it has to do with the intensely personal stories that a lot of horror in any medium tend to latch onto, but also the much stronger emphasis on mood and atmosphere that are often used to help build the tension and the scares. Remorse The List is a game with a lot of really interesting ideas and concepts. It is a first-person survival horror-ish game that utilizes inventory management, puzzles, and stiff combat controls that help add to the tension, which are all common elements of the horror gaming genre. The team behind Remorse The List is the Depressic team, a team best known for their original breakout hit, the Half-Life 2 mod, Grey, which saw the player as the titular character that took a lot of heavy inspiration from not only the Silent Hill franchise, but also the famous Half-Life 1 horror mod, Cry of Fear. I have a video here comparing the two, but I still hold the belief that Grey is a slightly misunderstood gem. I think the team behind it genuinely knew how to fuck with the player on a level beyond just cheap jump scares, which is something that I believe Cry of Fear relied a little bit too heavily on. The atmosphere was oppressive, its monster design was varied and unsettling, it fucked with the player enough, and even had a hugely varied second campaign on its unlockable hard mode, with alternate routes, enemies, and arguably scarier set pieces. While still not as content-filled as its Cry of Fear contemporary, one would be hard-pressed to consider Grey anything less than value for your time. But after being stuck in relative development hell, being announced in 2016 and being Steam greenlit the same year but essentially going radio silent up until October of 2021, I had pretty much completely given up hope that Remorse The List was ever going to see the light of day. So the fact that I'm sitting here and telling you about it is a very nice surprise, which is not unlike my last video about Tunic. Where Remorse The List differs in what makes it stand out, at least in my opinion, among its indie horror contemporaries, is that it is a self-described, semi-open world survival horror game. Now, this is something that immediately piqued my interest, and especially coming out of playing a lot of Elden Ring, I love the almost limitless potential that an open world horror game could pose to the genre. The only games offhand that are open world and explicitly a horror game are Darkwood, The Evil Within 2, and Silent Hill Downpour. And while I haven't played Darkwood or Evil Within 2, I can say for certain that while I greatly dislike Silent Hill Downpour, feeling that it not only botched the feel of the series, wasn't scary, and was riddled with bugs, I did and do still believe that the ambition that Downpour presented to me was undeniable. The idea of a horror setting such as Silent Hill being completely explorable with all kinds of detailed mini-dungeons that all have their own personalized little horrors in them is such an appealing concept to me. And not to add, with Elden Ring coming out and the potential for open worlds being expanded even further, it only seems to me the possibilities of an open-ish ended horror world is becoming more and more appealing and possible. And at first glance, Remorse The List does seem to at least get this concept right. It's a relatively tight and focused game with a decent range of monster designs, optional areas that occasionally provide rewards, and a heavy yet empty atmosphere as you meander and roam around the city. But despite these positives, I do think that Remorse The List feels unfinished, lacking a needed polish, but in the end is still a game that I do think is worth your time as an incredibly ambitious indie project that has an equal amount of potential as an idea, but unfortunately leaves a lot to be desired in its overall execution. The gameplay of Remorse The List is generally speaking not too distinct from a lot of its brethren. A horror-focused first-person adventure with survival horror tendencies such as strict emphasis on limited ammo, inventory management, and puzzles being a nice break from the norm gameplay speaking. While these segments are nothing new, they are mostly executed well. The guns pack a decent enough punch, and the melee weapons have enough of a wind-up and arc that they feel as impactful as they need to be to not feel as weak and floppy as an al dente noodle. Speaking of weapons, you're gonna need something to use them on, and the enemies of Remorse are in no short supply. While at first, the enemy designs honestly kind of seem pretty lame, as a majority of them seem to be literally just disfigured people, very reminiscent of the pretty lackluster designs in Silent Hill Downpour, a stain on the series known for its incredibly interesting and horrific monster designs. But while the game never really steers too far away from the disfigured human design overall, there are indeed a few highlights. The TV keyboard holding enemy with its twitchy bone-popping movements and its teleporting traversal make it an unnerving highlight. There is also an enemy that seems to essentially be a crime scene body highlight that plays out in a lot more of a mechanical first type of way, where they are invulnerable to damage until their body fills in the outline and they summon 3 pools of blood that stab you with glass shards. The thing though, however, at least in my opinion, is that these enemies, variations and all, with the exception of the body crime scene enemy, they all force you to tackle them in more or less exactly the same way, which is just run backwards and shoot. Now, I understand that a lot of survival horror games don't have very deep combat. Using the titans of the genre for the sake of comparison again, Resident Evil and Silent Hill both have stiff, awkward combat that primarily boil down to stand and shoot, or stand and melee. Silent Hill has a bit more leeway with its combat, as you can actually move and shoot, and with enough practice you can essentially circle around some of the enemies and beat them to death with a plank of wood, but generally speaking they have the same restriction. The thing that I think makes Remorse's combat much less interesting and feel less enjoyable than even Resident Evil's stiff, immovable combat is that with Resident Evil, you are forced to strategize with your character placement. How far away can you reasonably stand and shoot a zombie before it reaches you? Will you be able to shoot and move fast enough while dealing with a hunter? In Remorse, the enemies all essentially just charge at you from far away, and with the much more open combat that comes with the nature of being a first-person shooter, it feels really restrictive that the only option that is posed to you for just about every single enemy is walk backwards and shoot, or walk backwards, stop real quick, melee, and then walk backwards again. I will say that there is a modicum of skill involved here when it comes to the melee combat, with knowing the timing of stopping to swing to avoid as much damage as possible. It also doesn't help that the hit detection is a little jank, especially on this enemy here that crawls along the floor, because of the way that his hitbox is designed, it feels legitimately impossible to avoid taking damage sometimes. You can see here that I'm backing up and even jumping, but even while I'm in the air, or what seems to be completely out of the range for his short-range melee arm swing attack, that I'm susceptible to his swing, and after a certain threshold of getting hit by this in ways that do feel a little unfair, it's less fear of a monster barreling towards you and more reminiscent of seeing a friend who you don't like anymore and being afraid to tell them this to their face. Remorse the List's biggest distinction from not only Grey, but also a lot of horror games is, as mentioned previously, its open world. Well, semi-open world. And I think that this is not only the game's biggest strength, but unfortunately its biggest wasted potential. At first glance, the world of Remorse, the small Hungarian town of that place, feels like a real believable little town. A slice of semi-translucent reality carved out of a well-made little nightmare cake. Wandering around its abandoned streets and buildings and solving its, mostly, very well-made puzzles is what I think the developers nailed the most, especially on the first playthrough. The first few hours of my time with Remorse were almost exactly what I was hoping for when I heard the game was utilizing an open world. A lot of streets with a lot of optional places to explore that could potentially hide well-designed little mini-dungeons that all provided their own fine-tuned scares and rewards. But as I got further along in the game, I slowly realized that that wistful hope for the layout of the game's world wasn't quite what I had hoped for. To set the scene for you, let me tell you the highlight of the game for me. This isn't a spoiler? No, don't worry. The first area that I went to, for example, the eastmost side of the map, was the hospital. Its big looming presence with its seemingly randomly lit windows emitted a real sense of foreboding, looming evil that my mind wandered around with what could be waiting for me in its cold, intimidating interior. But I checked my map, and I saw a few side streets that I could walk down, so I decided to go and check those out first. So I wandered down one of them, and I came upon what seemed to be an apartment building with markings all around the entrance. I checked to see if I could go in, and lo and behold, I could. The immediate sense of potential doom wandering into the building was almost deafening. My blood boiled in suspense. I could feel that this was a potential side story that I just stumbled upon in the world of Remorse. I was giddy with the excitement of finding something off the beaten path. And as I solved its rather basic initial puzzle, I found myself in the basement, reminiscent of Silent Hill's Otherworld that had another, much more mentally intensive puzzle, and I was enthralled at imagining the whole game having this format, but on a grander scale with the bigger dungeon-like areas, such as that looming hospital that lied just outside. But once I gained access to the hospital, that was kind of when the cracks started to show a little bit. The placement of enemies in horror games is easily one of the most crucial aspects of what can actually make or break the horror in these kinds of games. And so much of the game's enemies are placed in such a way that they're only revealed immediately once you turn a corner. This is not anything new or necessarily wrong, but it wasn't long after the hospital that I was guessing out loud to myself after a few minutes without seeing any enemy around and saying to myself, oh, I bet there's going to be a monster here once I make this turn, and being right literally 80% of the time. This isn't and shouldn't be an issue, but when the game's horror relies so heavily on startling you with a monster charging super fast at you, and praise to God that you go, holy shit, that starts to wear thin pretty quickly. The hospital also unfortunately reveals the level design's biggest weakness, and that is its overall simplistic and bite-sized nature. Look, I'm not sure if this is a me problem, maybe expecting too much from an indie title, but when I look at the hospital from the outside, or this apartment building, or this police station, I sort of expect there to be, well, like a dungeon in there, like the games that Remorse is taking so much inspiration from. A relatively big puzzle box level that requires backtracking, and one that, especially given the nature of Remorse in particular, open-ended. But to my unfortunate disappointment, the hospital is the biggest area of the game apart from the town itself, and its entire level consists of 2 floors, 7-ish rooms, 1 puzzle, and a required hidden area that may or may not require backtracking because I accidentally found it before I found the clues to find it in the boss arena. But I do want to be clear that none of what I've said so far means that the world or design of Remorse The List is inherently, bad. None of what I've told you up to this point should be justified in saying that the team behind the game fucked up. The world being optimized as an open world is just not there. It feels underutilized as an idea and makes you wonder why the team sought out to make it an open-ended world to begin with. You have this big map with all of these separate locations that occasionally have small little locations such as this little snack shop here, or this demolished house, and there is just, nothing there. Whenever you find a smaller location such as the pharmacy or the corner store, it's usually just one little room that will hold some supplies like first aid or ammo. But this is where my concern kind of comes in, because even in the game's announcement trailer, they have this exact demolished house in the trailer, and there is this implication of something really sinister going on here, and there's also this motif of repeating nightmares that progress further and further into horror, but neither of these things are present at all in the final product. And that's what I mean when I say that the game feels somewhat unfinished. For all of the locations that the game provides, it feels that each one is kind of flat, a little bit static, and doesn't take advantage of not only the open world, but doesn't even take advantage of the available locations that the game provides to you. I think by now you might be asking yourself if I even like this game at all, which I guess at this point is understandable, but I don't think that way. After all of this, I think that the game inherently has enough going for it that I think you should give Remorse The List a purchase and give it a whirl. While the replay value isn't as something as high like Cry of Fear or even its predecessor Grey, with its lack of an alternate second route which does kind of feel a little cheap in the long run, there is a hard mode that alters enemy placement and makes ammo and healing items much scarcer. I think the added challenge is a good rebalance of the main game and still manages to feel fair and appropriately difficult. There are also unlockable challenges that help add to the value of the game, which are fun, even though there is a disturbing lack of music. It's an empty void devoid of sound, leaving nothing but your own heartbeat and the existential knowledge that you'll die one day, and even though the only thing that you can hear is the beating of your own heart and the screams of the monsters, you know that in this moment you were alive, but you have to press on to find the reason. The trade-off here is that the world of Remorse, with all of these little design faults, seem to excel at essentially being a giant puzzle box. There are many instances of backtracking, which is exactly what I want and expect from a survival horror game. You are never forced to traverse the entire map lengthwise to get something. Each area of the map is designated with its own little focused goal. For example, the previously mentioned hospital requires 3 medical documents to get into the building. You get them from the aforementioned apartment building, a sewer system from the next street over, and the third one is a loading screen away in a bar. Even though this all coalesces into a more or less same bite of a bite-sized nature that I was talking about in the specific dungeons, it does make the world traversal, which is more or less what you'll be doing for a vast majority of the game, a lot less tedious, and makes the entire world design feel more cohesive than it would have been if the team had decided to make you backtrack across the entire map multiple times to gain access to some of these specific locations. It kind of ends up feeling more like a modern Resident Evil Nemesis in terms of how the world is used. A lot more focus in its overall city design and utilizing the aspect of being a city a lot more fully than Nemesis did over 20 years ago. But the thing that Remorse has over a lot more recent horror games, especially the more mainstream ones, is the entire world being built around speedrunning it. Just like the old horror games of yesteryear, the game world upon completion opens up to become its own challenge and minigame. I've beaten Remorse 4 times by the time I'm writing this, and each time has become more and more of a game to beat my original time. My current best at this time is just over an hour, and I honestly could see a small speedrunning community building around this game. It's just buggy enough being an indie game that I feel like if someone really committed to it, you could break this game in half time-wise. But the blueprint of a true open-world survival horror game has been laid out in Remorse The List. And if the team gives this template another whirl, or another team can look at what Remorse did right and wrong, then I think that whatever comes out of the lessons learned from this game could potentially be one of the best and most interesting horror games to come out in a very, very long time. I think I'm mostly disappointed because I can see that game somewhere buried beneath this game's code. Hey, I just want to say thank you if you made it to the end of the video. It means a lot. I also want to apologize for this video taking so fucking long. I had a bunch of shit going on with work. I quit my job. I have a new job. Things are going pretty good. I was able to finish this video barely by the skin of my teeth, but the next video won't be as long to make, I promise. I love your face. I love your show.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.